Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I thought that I would make a video today talking about why people choose, or why some people may choose to stay in abusive relationships, whether they're, physically abusive, emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive. I can't remember if I said physically abusive already, but there's many different kinds of abuse out there, and so there, it's not uncommon for people to choose to stay in these relationships, and they're incredibly complicated, and it's hard to relate to unless you've ever been in one yourself. But you might think isn't it obvious that somebody should not stay in an abusive relationship? It's usually more obvious, I think, or it can be more obvious to the person, like to people that are close to the victim, that are looking at things from the outside in. But oftentimes when you're in an abusive relationship, there's so many things that sort of cloud your judgment, and it could be anything from what's called a trauma bond. For example, that might be like, it just might be, the abuse might be familiar to the victim. What do I mean by that? So it could be that, the victim may have grown up with an abusive parent, and so that's all that they've ever known, and they don't really understand or have ever really had a good example, a healthy example of what it truly means to be loved in a healthy way. And so oftentimes if somebody grows up with as an abused child, when they get into their young adulthood or adulthood, when they actually start dating and seeking out relationships, romantic relationships, they will subconsciously look for relationships that feel familiar, because they've essentially been programmed or wired from a young age to understand abuse as love. And, people that come from that type of background can go through many cycles of this throughout their adulthood. And it can start to almost feel like they are dating the same person, but a different face, if that makes sense. So like the same types of characteristics, but, Joe versus Tom, or Tom versus Christopher, or anything like that. Just literally different individuals, but all having the same abusive characteristics. And so when you start replicating those toxic cycles as an adult, you're not always really aware of it, especially in the beginning. It can take repeating those same patterns multiple times before you start to recognize, like, hey, wait a minute, like, is this me? Am I the issue? Or is it the other person? Do I just have bad luck? Am I the one that's the problem? Something like this. So trauma bond is a major reason, I think, that people tend to stay in abusive relationships. The other reason is it could just be the type of abuse that's not really super talked about, such as narcissistic abuse. It can be so, these types of individuals specifically, they can look like ideal, wonderful partners, be great on paper, but in reality, these types of people treat those closest to them the absolute worst. So, but it can be very subtle. It's very tricky. There's a lot of trickery in narcissistic abuse, or like, if you're dealing with somebody who's physically abusive, I think in general, people that are abusive tend to do it behind closed doors, because they're very, they don't want people to know who they really are. And so my point is that somebody who is experiencing abuse it can be so subtle that they know something feels off and something feels wrong, and maybe they're having some ill effects on their health due to the abuse, but they can't quite put their finger on it because maybe they've never heard of narcissistic abuse, or emotional abuse. It's not something that they've been educated on. So that can be another reason that somebody chooses to stay in a relationship, because they just plain and simple they know something's not right, but they can't quite put their finger on it, and they're just not educated on the topic. Another reason that somebody might choose to stay in a relationship stay in an abusive relationship is that they might just suffer from low self-esteem. And that's not uncommon if you come from a dysfunctional childhood, or maybe you're like in a place in life where you're just not feeling super confident about it. Maybe you're not where you'd like to be in your career. Maybe you feel the abuser has somehow made you feel dependent on them, so you feel like you can't survive without this person, whether that's emotionally or financially, or something like that. That's another reason. That's a really big reason. Actually, a lot of people who are married that financially depend on their partner, because, either that's just how it worked out when they had kids or whatever, or the abuser made, sort of orchestrated things so that their spouse would be reliant on them, dependent on them financially. So then, that person might feel like they have no skills. The spouse might feel like they don't have any skills to survive out in the real world. There may be children involved. So that's another reason that they may have low self-esteem, or they're just terrified that they just feel like they can't survive out there in the real world, and they literally feel like they need their partners or their, for survival, which is totally understandable. And it can be really hard for people to get the courage to leave, to get out, and try to make it on their own. If you see me looking down, I'm just looking at my notes here. I try to write notes before I make a video. And then, of course, let's not forget love. People, despite the abuse, think that their abusive partner loves them. Now, a healthy person would be able to recognize that the abuse is not love. But if you are somebody who has experienced abuse since childhood, you have that trauma bond built in there, which makes you think, your brain is wired to understand abuse as love. And it can feel really terrifying and really devastating. It's a very deep-rooted feeling and a very deep-rooted fear to feel like that love, what you understand as love, is being taken from you. And so that's also a reason that somebody might stay in an abusive relationship. And so I think It is very difficult for people to understand that have not experienced um, an abusive relationship. Even healthy people can experience, emotionally healthy people can also become the victims of abuse. I think the difference, though, is that it generally doesn't last that long, usually because an emotionally healthy person really loves themselves and they aren't going to allow someone to mistreat them. They usually have strong boundaries, and they have a strong sense of self. They are able to really trust their own intuition when they feel that something is off, that something's not right, and they generally will not stand for mistreatment. And so something we can actually learn from narcissists in particular is, they always, they give off the persona that they really love themselves and they will not put up with anything less than the best. In reality, they actually don't really love themselves, but they give off this persona that they do. So we can learn something from them and make sure that we love ourselves. I think, one of the mistakes that you can make when you're in an abusive relationship, especially if you're really empathic and you really love really hard, and maybe it's your first love, or maybe you're just somebody who has a really good heart, is a very loving person. I mean, you can actually, and if you don't have that healthy, if you don't have a healthy emotional love for yourself, you can end up loving that other person way more than yourself. And I think that's really dangerous, because when you love someone else more than you love yourself, that type of person, the abuser, will take everything from you. Your sanity, your health, your emotional well-being, so your emotional health, your physical health, these things really have a devastating effect on you as a whole. And these people, abusers, they really do not care about you. And so self-love really is self-love really is your key to survival. And it's just so essential. You have to love yourself. You must. Because if you engage in the wrong relationship, it can literally be a matter of life or death. I think that self-awareness really, really helps. And sometimes it can take us it can take a long time to recognize your unhealthy patterns. A lot of times in abusive relationships, as the victim, you really do see yourself as the victim, and you totally are. You are the victim. But I think that where you start to turn things around is by refusing to be the victim. By sort of taking life by the reins and saying, I'm not going to be a victim anymore, and I am going to take the situation into my own control. I think that's true for a lot of things in life, but especially, you know, going through life, like, especially like if you've been in multiple abusive relationships, taking a stand for yourself and just really saying, like, no more. I am not going to allow myself to be a victim any longer. And you're just kind of like really taking a stand for yourself. You're deciding that you are going to love yourself. You're deciding to put up strong boundaries. I really think that those two things are like some of the best things that you can do for yourself. Whether you're in an abusive relationship or not, those are absolutely essential, and not everybody gets taught that in their childhood. So I think if you're raising children, it's really important, or maybe you have a friend who's in an abusive relationship, or maybe you're in an abusive relationship, reminding that person of the importance of having strong boundaries and loving themselves first is really, really important, because it literally can be a matter of life or death. I'm not even being dramatic here. There are so many abusive relationships that end in the victim losing their life. And so it's like a really serious topic. It's something that people need to be very careful of. And I think the point is that if you love yourself, you put yourself first, and you have strong boundaries, those three things right there are very likely going to repel somebody who is abusive, somebody who's trying to use you, someone who is trying to hurt you. So they're important traits to have, or traits or skills, whatever you want to call them. So anyways, I'm always curious to hear about people's thoughts or people's situations. Maybe you or a friend got out of an abusive relationship. I would really be curious to hear what you feel helped you get out of that relationship. Did you finally come to a place where you understood that you had to love yourself more than the other person, and like you made that decision to get out of that relationship? Or was it something else that got you out of it? I would be curious to know. So if you have anything that you would like to share, or you'd like to talk about your experience, leave it down in the comments below. Thanks.